Click the word. Right, hello everyone. Today we have a slightly unconventional lunch seminar in the sense that a lot of people are away and we didn't really have a topic planned this week, but Gustavo asked me to give this talk because I had presented earlier this semester at CERN. And so what's interesting about this topic is that I will be presenting about a project that's actually 8 years old. So this project was started when I was still in high school and I didn't even know what an FPGA is. Luckily enough, over the last 3 years, I've been involved with this project, and I'm now the coordinator of this project. And as I hope to convince you today, you might also use it in your research. And also, other interesting thing, today I will actually get you to see how FPGAs work and run a live demo. For those of you who are scared of FPGAs, hopefully you won't be scared anymore. For those of you who know what the nightmares of FPGAs are, perfect, you'll continue having them. So I'll talk about hls4ml today, as the title implies. And so I will give a first introduction as to how this project came to be some 8 years ago, why we need it, and when it might make sense to use FPGAs. Then I'll give a background on FPGAs, because again, I know we're a huge group with a lot of different research interests, and we might not always understand what other people are working on. I certainly don't understand what the in-depth of everyone that is working on, so I really want to democratize FPGAs a bit more and really build them up bottom up. Then I will talk about hls4ml. That's the crux of this talk, and then we will have a live demo. So as I said earlier, hls4ml is just a package for converting neural networks to FPGA firmware, and this is built for extremely low latency inference. Today, what we will talk about is how we can use FPGAs for neural networks, and also what are some of the techniques we can use for FPGA acceleration of neural networks, namely quantization and parallelization. These are not new techniques. I'm not preaching anything new state of the art. This is something we've known for decades, but it has a slightly different flavor to FPGAs and machine learning. Before I can do any of that, I do need to talk about how this project came to exist again, a decade ago. About 2012 is when machine learning again started getting a huge boom, and with these ImageNet models and GPUs becoming better and better, a lot of industries started accepting machine learning filtering and data processing for their workloads. And as we've all seen recently, the Nobel Prize for either chemistry or biology, I'm not actually sure, was awarded to an AI workload for the AlphaGo, right? And naturally so, physicists also a decade ago started using machine learning for analyzing data in their experiments. We did have a Compass talk about 2 weeks ago on this, and I won't talk too much about this. For those of you who went to it, you already know the background. For those of you who didn't, please go and watch that talk. It was very interesting. But the main idea is at CERN, they collide particles at huge frequencies, nearly at the speed of light. And so by doing that, they generate hundreds of terabytes of data each second. These sensors generate huge, huge amounts of data, which to us as computer systems researchers is, of course, very interesting. At some point, I was in a talk that actually mentioned that this data is about 4% of the internet traffic at the peak of its experiment. I don't know if that's actually true, but if it is, that's actually quite insane to think about it. So 4% of the worldwide internet traffic. What's even sadder than that is that these events actually are not that interesting. Most of this is actually not useful data. It can be discarded and it doesn't drive physics research. Otherwise, physicists would be having very easy jobs, and we can't have that. So what they do is they filter this data in real time. They discard most of it in a process called triggering. So the idea is we analyze this data in real time. We discard it before having to store it offline and process it further on. And of course, this was originally rule-based algorithms, but in the last decade, they switched to machine learning algorithms because it's very good for large amounts of data and for anomaly detection. The main problem with this is we have very strict latency constraints. So the latency constraints in the FPGAs that we're operating on are typically tens of microseconds. And this is something that you will never be able to get with a GPU or a CPU for machine learning inference. And that's what I'm hoping to convince you today, that FPGAs do have a place in the whole ML ecosystem. Just to visualize this a bit better, if you're running ChatGPT, which I guess most of us have run at some point, you're typically getting a response in 1 to 3 seconds. Now, of course, most of us agree this is not real time. This, of course, goes over the internet. There's a server, there's cloud, there's multiple GPUs. This is, of course, not real time. But it's still very fast to our eye, and we can still very quickly get a response. On the other hand, self-driving cars are a prime example of, let's say, machine learning for critical applications. And for self-driving cars, we're typically running in 50 milliseconds ranges, right? So this is still quite fast. I think most of us would consider self-driving cars to be safety critical in real time, but compare this to what I'm going to show you today, where we run inference in 500 nanoseconds. So orders of magnitude faster. Again, not to say one is easier or harder than the other, it's just to say there are different problems and different hardware and techniques need to be used for each one of those. And so why should we use FPGAs? I promise they're not as scary and they have a use case. Well, we use FPGAs for two main reasons. First is they give us full control over the hardware. We can control how the hardware behaves, we can control the precisions, and we can have custom data movement and memory management. Secondly, with FPGAs, we generally don't have any overhead. On both GPUs and CPUs, we have scheduling and also interrupts, and this is generally a source of some overhead. On FPGAs, if you use them properly, you can avoid all of this and have no scheduling overheads. And I like to think of FPGAs as being in between ASICs and then CPUs and GPUs on the other side. So they're still a pain in the neck to program. You still need a lot of domain-specific expertise, but you're getting closer to an ASIC compared to a GPU and a CPU. So why do we use FPGAs? Well, the first important thing is they enable both time and space multiplexing. And what does that mean? Well, at any given moment, we can share the chip for multiple resources, but we can also reuse that same part of chip later on for a different part of the computation. If you look on your left, on my right, on this convolutional neural network that we put on an FPGA, we have these different stages of computation. For those of you not familiar with machine learning, just think about this as different parts of the inference, right? Different part that you have to compute. Some are matrix multiplies, some are activation, some are control logic. And if we follow the color code, we can see that actually the FPGA has been now spatially partitioned. Each part of this computation gets a part of the chip. And that's what makes FPGAs very powerful, because we can tune each part of the chip to do exactly what we want to the precision and memory access pattern. And so what we get is, with this, we get deeply pipelined streaming architectures, which are highly optimized for the application we want, but which we can also reuse for future computations. Now, on the other hand, compared to GPUs, which I think most people are slightly more familiar in this group, is in GPUs, layers are generally processed sequentially. So GPUs do allow some spatial sharing. Recently, in the GPUs are trying to push this a bit more, but it's generally not what you're using GPUs for. When you launch a workload on a GPU, you launch it on the whole GPU, and you use basically the kernel gets access to the whole GPU by default. And also GPUs have generally not very good support for lower precisions. So in recent years, we've seen the increase in int8 and block floating point support, but in general, FPGAs are still far, far superior when it comes to accelerating random weights. So if you had, for example, 6-bit precisions, your GPU would be more than useless there. It would still zero pad everything to 8 bits. If you have binary weights, again, very hard to use binary, like single-bit operands on the GPU. You still have to zero pad it, probably some memory alignment. On FPGAs, none of this happens. And finally, the big problem of this is also that GPUs generally use the whole memory infrastructure, so the data moves all the way from the cache all the way to the HBM. And sometimes you don't want that. You might want to keep the data in the local cache and not go to the HBM. Generally, FPGAs, again, slightly more control. Now, that's not to say that GPUs are terrible. GPUs are still great. NVIDIA's made a lot of money. Please don't say that I'm thinking GPUs are terrible. They still have a much higher frequency than FPGAs, about 10 times the frequency. There's still more memory and more memory bandwidth available, and they're also much better for a lot of number crunch. So for LLMs, the GPUs are unparalleled.
So can you go back to your previous diagram where you were like, yeah, exactly. So if like for the GPUs, for example, you have, let's say, the compute unit, like the SEMs, and the memory bus, and like let's say 2 ways to construct something like that.
Yep.
In GPU, one is to separate only the SEMs, and the other is to separate both the SEMs and the memory or the buses. How is it exactly here? Is it like, should we think of these as like the compute units of the FPGA, or like, sorry.
Can that question wait about 5 minutes until I explain what makes an FPGA? The answer to that is you can partition everything: memory, compute units, and the compute units are variable. So the compute units, so GPUs have fixed instructions, right? Here, the instructions are not fixed. You define the instructions.
Yeah.
So, but we'll come back. I hope the next part can figure that out. So, FPGAs, yes.
Just a question about context. Where does this stand in comparison to FIN?
It's very similar. It's a sister project. So both of these projects started about the same time. They have a lot of ongoing collaboration still to this day. I'll talk about the differences later on, but I think we can take that up, but a very similar project. So when should you use FPGA? When you have extremely low latency requirements. So if you have hundreds of nanoseconds requirements, please use an FPGA or an ASIC. You will never get away with this on a CPU and a GPU unless you have a really high frequency CPU and some real-time operating system, then you might be able to squeeze that out. When you have low power environments and you have generally constrained environments, so where you need lower power, use FPGAs. They're generally more power efficient. I'll show you an example later on how we deployed, or a project deployed FPGAs in space, which is very cool, I think. And then also in network processing, a lot of the work that we do in our groups, of course, is within network because FPGAs are naturally built for this. So data comes in streams. We have data flow applications. So FPGAs are, again, very good at this. And again, where you have custom precisions and highly regular operations, FPGAs are good. A lot of the previous work by you and Wenqi has shown that wherever you have embeddings or pre-processings that are not necessarily very regular, the FPGA can be a good fit for these. Okay, are there any questions on this before I explain what actually makes an FPGA? No, perfect. So FPGAs in general are built of three important things: DSPs, the green things here, block RAM, also the green things, and then the orange slices, the lookup tables, and the flip-flops. The logic cells, or the lookup tables as they're called on AMD GPUs, are the smallest building blocks. This would be similar to the compute units, but not quite. And they're used to implementing arbitrary Boolean operations. So you can implement your AND, your OR, your NOT, your XOR, and after that, you can chain them to implement whatever you want. With that, of course, the more you chain them, the more complex operations you get: addition, exponentials, anything you might want to do. And then flip-flops, think of these as your CPU registers. They store data on every clock cycle, and data can be read at every clock cycles. So they're very fast, but of course very limited. Still, an FPGA has many more registers than a CPU. So this is how you implement arbitrary Boolean operations on an FPGA. Then we also have DSPs, digital signal processing blocks. These would be slightly more similar to the compute units on the GPU, where these are used for mathematical operations, for signal processing applications. Most commonly, these are used for multiplications in the context of neural networks. The main problem, again, these are very limited. Even state-of-the-art state-of-the-art FPGAs have around 10,000 DSPs, which really means at any given time, you can execute 10,000 multiplications in parallel. So if you have highly parallel number crunching, use a GPU. Please don't use an FPGA. But if you do need to perform some mathematics on the FPGA, they have these DSPs that are very fast and very good at maths. They can do multiplication in one clock cycle. And then we have block RAM, or BRAM, which is this local FPGA memory. It's essentially the same as the L1 cache to the CPU. You can access data in one clock cycle, but it is very small. So you only have around 40 megabytes of available memory. Recent FPGAs, important to mention, also have off-chip memory with HBM and DDR, a lot of the similar advantages that GPUs have. So if you have bigger applications, you can use HBM, but the big advantage of FPGAs is they give you full control of block memory. So you can use these 40 megabytes however you want for your application. And of course, in addition, FPGAs come with a lot of the different bells and whistles that make them good in bigger systems. So they come with PCIe connects. As we've seen, FPGAs have been integrated with Enzion. They can be used for networking. Stern has a whole fleet of these to be deployed in sensors, right? So they come with a lot of these additional high-speed transceivers that make them very interesting in larger computer systems, and they're generally more power efficient. Any questions on this so far? No, okay. So how are FPGAs programmed? Traditionally, FPGAs were programmed using hardware description languages, or HDL. This is your Verilog and your VHDL. These are very low-level languages that give you a lot of the control over the hardware, and also have caused a lot of people to lose a lot of hair and sleep over the years. They require a lot of domain-specific expertise, and you really need to know how the hardware works. On the other hand, a more recent trend is using high-level synthesis, also called HLS, which is a programming paradigm which raises the level of abstraction. So developers can now write C and C++ with some additional directives, and I'll give 2 examples of this in a minute, to describe FPGA circuits. The entire idea is now development is much faster, so you don't necessarily have to spend months and months writing Verilog. And then once you write your C++ code, you give it to an HLS compiler, and this then gets converted down to Verilog. So if we follow these steps, it gets converted down to Verilog, which can then be put on an FPGA. And so this should hopefully raise the level of abstraction and make more people use FPGAs. And in today's tutorial, we'll be using Vitis HLS from AMD, which is the most recent version of HLS that exists on the market from AMD. And so just 2 examples of what a pragma or directive looks like and how you would describe hardware using C++ is the first example. We just have a for loop that executes 16 times and it adds 2 vectors, right? A and B, and stores it into C, nothing fancy. This is just standard C++. But we now have this weird line pragma HLS unroll, which basically says I want to parallelize this loop 4 times. So at any given clock cycle, there is four same bodies of this loop executing in hardware, which means if we have 16 of the iterations, this will take 4 clock cycles. So 16 divided by 4, 4 clock cycles, because in each clock cycle, we perform 4 times this for loop. And the nice thing about this is you write this line of code and you get your hardware. You don't have to care about scheduling, about control, about how the signals iterate and what handles what. You simply write this line and you have parallelization working. Second example, let's say we have this matrix of weights, right? It has 16 elements, and I want to store this in block memory. So the first thing I want to say is, well, okay, how am I accessing this memory? Do I want to access 1 element each clock cycle? That could be 16 by 1, for example. Or do I want to access 4 elements in 1 clock cycle? So taking me 4 clock cycles. Well, then I would store the memory in 4 by 4. And that's exactly what this block factor does. So you can define a block factor specifying how you want the memory to be laid out physically to know how to access this data. And the second one says, okay, I want this memory to only be read-only, and I want it to be a 2-port block RAM, so for more throughput, if you might want to have more ports available. And there's plenty of these. There's hundreds of these, and if you're interested in these, please go have a look at the AMD handbook. It's a very lovely read of 1,000 pages of different pragmas you might use in hardware. Are there any questions how we program FPGAs?
I don't know much about FPGAs,
Okay.
but basically you have your hardware and you have the compute units arranged on the FPGA.
Okay.
You also, when you program it, you need to say, okay, I want these units on the left
No.
to do this.
No, so that's all automated. So as long as you can describe your hardware reasonably well logically, the FPGA tools handle that for you. So it's a process called place and route, which basically takes your hardware description of any layout and it figures out how to place this on the physical FPGA.
Okay.
But these are tools from AMD and Intel. These cost thousands of dollars, and people have spent decades researching this. So this is really not something that the average user does. This is something that's pre-provided.
So even if I don't use HLS and I use like the low level stuff,
Yes.
I still don't deal with that.
You still don't have to say what goes where on the
Okay.
physical FPGA. No. Any other questions?
So I have a question, because normally in a neural network, there are multiple layers. So question is that every time when you want to create a bit stream, you need to synthesize all the layers, or you can use some pre-built RP for each layer, and then you can combine it as a random sequence as you want.
You have to generate a new bit stream exactly because you can tune every layer individually. So if you had a fixed architecture, so if you had something like a systolic array on the FPGA, then you wouldn't have to, because then you have an overlay essentially, but that's much slower. What we do here is we have a data flow where you ultimately can tune every layer to what you want it to be. And so, it's a trade-off between how long do you spend compiling versus how fast you want your circuit to be. Otini had a question.
I want to ask about the previous question, like, can you say where you want to place everything? Like, I know you said that you don't have to, but can you do?
Yes. Yes. So you can specify floor planning, and this is generally considered advanced FPGA stuff because then you can get higher frequency, because essentially when you do that, you still have to take into account that your signals have to propagate with one clock cycle. And if stuff is physically far away, then it's not going to propagate. So a lot of these tools try to optimize the signal propagation to meet the target frequency. And the way they do it is actually random. They started using ML these days, they throw something, they figure out that it doesn't work, and then they do reinforcement learning. So yes, you can do that, but please don't do that. Any more questions? Okay. So what is hls4ml today? So this is the crux of this talk. hls4ml is an open source framework for accelerating neural networks on FPGAs. It was built at CERN around 8 years ago now, but since then it's grown to a huge project with many collaborators. I'm very happy to say that I'm one of the 2 coordinators now of this project for the next 2 years. And so I want to talk to you about what you can do with this tool and how you can use it. So first of all, unlike many of the tools that you can see on the market, for example, Fin, hls4ml is both front-end and back-end agnostic. So you can train your models in Keras, in PyTorch, and in Onyx. And you can just pass it to hls4ml and it's going to work. And it's also back-end agnostic. So many of the tools work only on one specific FPGA board, Intel or AMD, or some other lattice FPGAs. But generally, hls4ml is back-end agnostic. It supports Vivado HLS and Vitis HLS for AMD boards, Intel HLS, and one API. So these are just newer versions of each other. On Intel FPGAs, and also recent addition added Siemens Catapult HLS as a completely independent HLS vendor. It has many supported layers, so all of your standard CNNs, fully connected networks, recurrent neural networks, graph processing algorithms, and also transformers have been recently proposed. They're still not ready, but they've been in work. It has a lot of configurability. As you'll see today, you have the full ability to tune the precision, the trade-off between latency and resources, where you want stuff to be stored. So if you want to get the most out of your system, you can, but you don't have to. There's a set of default configurations that work just fine. And of course, it's a very active and open source community. So this has now grown more and bigger than just a simple project at CERN. It has many collaborators from many different fields and different institutions. And I'm hoping to talk to you about some of the also use cases that exist within this project. So just to look about how the project has grown, I took these stats a few days ago. And so this project now has 1.3 thousand stars, which for an FPGA project is actually quite a bit. And also the original paper, which was while I was still in high school, as I said, has over 500 citations. So this has really grown more than a simple scientific computing paradigm. It is really a full-fledged FPGA stack for machine learning. And so we also have active seminars. Part of my job as coordinator is also to have these seminars. And so last week we had a presentation of deploying FPGAs in space from a university in Greece, a company in France combined with CERN. And so they looked into how they can put AI models on space, on satellites to do live data compression using FPGAs. So if you're interested in these sort of hardware acceleration, ML, efficient ML, and also applications, please reach out so I can add you to the mailing list where you might want to present something. And so some of the use cases already hinted before, there's self-driving cars. So this has been a very fruitful collaboration between a self-driving company called Zensact and then CERN, where they've shown how you can use CNNs for real-time, real-time traffic prediction in a way using FPGAs. Then a very recent paper also looked into using ML on FPGAs for biomedical purposes. Please don't ask me what any of these words mean. I have no idea what biomedical purposes are, but I found this online before a few weeks ago. And then, of course, you've already seen the talk by me and Max a few weeks ago, how we as systems people can use this, for example, for network applications. Again, to say ML is very versatile. There are plenty of use cases where we don't have to use it and where standard algorithms are good, but also plenty of use cases where ML and statistical methods in general are good and they can benefit from FPGA acceleration. So it's a nice trade-off we need to find. Are there any questions? No. Okay, so I'm going to talk about now what hls4ml is, how it works, and then we're going to the live demo, and that's hopefully it. So this is now the more technical part of this, this session. Again, I'll try to keep it as high level as possible, but please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. So hls4ml is really just a compiler. Just like a normal CPU compiler for C code, this is also just a compiler for FPGA programs. And if you look at this graph, it has 3 stages. And please keep in mind that the rectangle is user provided and the circle is automatically generated. So I want you to, after this slide, I want you to see that how there's very little that the user has to do and that you can very quickly get FPGA programs all automatically. So you have to start as a user from a high-level model. So you do have to go and collect your data set. You have to train your models. This is something that you as a domain expert have to do. So this is not something that anyone else can do other than the practitioner of the field. After that, we can quantize and sparsify the model. I will talk a bit more about quantization in this talk. Sparsity is not something I will talk about because, again, we had a talk a few weeks ago where this was covered quite nicely. So if you're interested more about sparsity, please go see that, or we can chat a bit afterwards. After that, but again, quantization and sparsity are very automatic processes. It doesn't really require a lot of user involvement. After that, this is where the core of hls4ml comes into place. And so the user has to provide a configuration. And this simply tells, okay, how do I want my hardware to behave? What's my target latency? How many resources can I use? Are there any other constraints I might want the compiler to know? It's very flexible, all a YAML file. And then we have optimizers and code generation. So optimizers, these are your standard compiler optimizers in the context of machine learning now. So if you have subsequent operations that can be merged, please merge them. If you have dead code, please get rid of the dead code. It could optimize how the data is laid out in memory. So it might say, okay, I want to transpose certain things so that it's better accessed in memory. So these are all your optimizers. And then we have the code templates. So hls4ml heavily relies on pre-provided parameterizable code templates in HLS. So we have these templates that are then essentially pulled from the repository and used to generate your own code depending on your model input sizes, shapes, and the configuration. And all of this, together with the optimizers, creates an HLS project. Then this project is simply passed on to a commercial HLS compiler, so Intel HLS or OneAPI, and then from there you get a FPGA bitstream. So this really is just a very fancy compiler for ML to hardware using optimizers and pre-provided code templates. And so there are 2 or 3 key things that we do to have very efficient inference. So inference in the orders of hundreds of nanoseconds, those being parallelization and quantization, and I will explain how we use each one of them. But before we can do any of that, we need to see what actually happens when we unpack a neural network. I won't talk about how neural networks work, but from a hardware point of view, we do know what they do very, very well. And I know I might upset some people, but actually most of neural network boils down to a matrix vector multiply, a bias addition, and an activation. And 95% of your operations are just this. With transformers, this has changed a bit, that we now have matrix multiplies, but 95% of operations, again, do boil down to this equation. Now, I know some people are probably thinking, wait a second, convolutions are not quite matrix vector multiplies. Actually, they are. So GPU vendors years ago figured out that it's much more efficient to transpose the weight matrix and use matrix vector multiplication in a transformation called image to column, which is much more efficient to do on GPUs than the actual convolution that you might see in signal processing. So most operations, again, do boil down to this equation, where we have a matrix vector multiply, which is just a gem. So as computer scientists, we know how gems work. We know how to implement them. On FPGAs, we use DSPs. Then we have a bias addition, which is just a logic. It's basically just simple arithmetic. It's addition. So we can use it. We can do this using logic cells. And then finally, we have an activation, which is basically just a very simple, again, arithmetic operation. And so what we try to do is we try to fit our design in the target resources, to fit within the target resources and latency, and also meet some operating frequency. So we want to have some idea of, how many DSPs are we going to use, how many lookup tables, how many flip-flops, and what is our latency. And to do that, we have 2 key knobs that we can tune to get the maximum of our system. The first one is parallelization. And this is really ancient, right? This has been known in computer science for decades. If you have a matrix multiplication, you can perform 4 multipliers in 1 clock cycle and finish in 1 clock cycle, or you could potentially do this across 2 clock cycles and then you do 2 each, or maybe you will do this fully serial across 4 clock cycles. Now, this is nothing new, right? This is, I think, very obvious to most people, but it's something that hls4ml exposes on a layer basis. So you can really tune each layer to perform as much as you want or as quickly as you want it, depending how big the layer is or how many resources it has. And this is a variable called reuse factor. Second thing is quantization. Their question. Any questions so far?
So you have a neural network on the FPGA board. So how do you transfer the input image to that FPGA?
That is something that hls4ml doesn't concern itself with, because we give you an IP. How you integrate that into a larger system is up to you, because there is some pre-provided examples on how to use XRT to move data from the CPU. But ultimately, these FPGAs are not meant for attaching to a CPU. This is meant for in-network processing, for attaching to sensors, right? It's very application specific how you want your neural network to run. So, what Max and I did is we generated the IP and we put it into Coyote, and this worked for us. But of course, physicists have sensors hooked up, so they need all sorts of other hardened resources to get the sensor data. So it really does depend on your application. At some point, you have to go and then integrate the IP into your larger system. Any other questions? Okay. Quantization, again, a very known thing in machine learning, and it's also been very well known in computing for decades now. And if you look at this graph on the left, we have these different precisions, and what we can actually see is that between an 8-bit add and then, for example, a 32-bit floating point multiplier, there's a huge range in energy. And of course, this can then, energy is just another metric for throughput or latency, depending how you want to spin and how powerful your system is. This is just a different view of different things. But ultimately, what we want to do and always want to do on an FPGA is quantize. We never want to use floating point numbers, because floating point numbers on an FPGA are very expensive. If you're using floating point numbers, please use a GPU. And so what we do is, the first thing we do is fixed point quantization. So we have FPGA support arbitrary fixed point quantization, where you can just say, I want 4 bits for the integer and 6 bits for the fractional. So for example, we have this number here, and then you can convert this number to a decimal and figure out that very quickly that this is 5.75. And so one thing that we do is we do post-training quantization. All of the network parameters are actually quantized after training to fixed points. So if they're no longer 32-bit floating point, they go down to fixed point. And I know some of you might be now thinking, doesn't that actually lose accuracy? Turns out in most cases, you can quantize down to 16 bits at least. So we have an example of a figure here where we had a physics problem, I think, that I took from the previous slides. And we scan the number of fractional bits and the number of integer bits in our fixed point number. So we fix the one and we scan the other, and then we look at what points do we get saturation. And what we can actually see is, well, our results have no drop in accuracy after 6 integer bits and 7 fractional bits. So in total, we need 13 bits to represent our weights compared to the full 32-bit floating point we had during training. So that's nearly a 2.5 times saving compared to the additional saving we had in handling floating point numbers just to perform the arithmetic. Now, post-training quantization can only take us so far. Quantization aware training is the new best technique, and it's again been widely accepted in machine learning. And the idea is that we can train our models with quantization to very low precision. And a lot of the work, I won't go into the theory how this works, but the idea is that during the forward pass, you quantize it and that you almost capture the loss associated with quantization. And then what happens is during the backward pass, you correct this and you can go to very, very low precisions. So early works from Imperial and AMD have shown that you can even have binary models, so just 1-bit neural networks. And of course, recent work from Microsoft has shown that you can have LLMs that are only ternary, so 2-bit models. So there's a lot of active work showing that, hey, we don't need 32-bit floating point, and please don't do 32-bit floating point because it's very expensive. Can we maybe use fixed point numbers?